Zhongli village lay flattened under the sun like a defeated dog that has given up on finding shade. All around there was nothing but the bare yellow earth, cracked into the pattern of a turtle's shell, and the sere bone smell of hot dust. It was the 4th year of the drought. Knowing the cause of their suffering, the peasants cursed their barbarian emperor in his distant capital in the north. As with any two like things connected by a thread of qi, whereby the actions of one influence the other even at a distance, so an emperor's worthiness determines the fate of the land he rules. The worthy ruler's dominion is graced with good harvests, the unworthy's is cursed by flood, drought, and disease. The present ruler of the empire of the Great Yuan was not only emperor, but Great Khan too. He was 10th of the line of the Mongol conqueror Kublai Khan, who had defeated the last native dynasty 70 years before. He had held the divine light of the mandate of heaven for 11 years, and already there were 10-year-olds who had never known anything but disaster. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scylla's Poecats. And today I have a very special review for you, for all of those who've already guessed it from the first page that I just read out. It's She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chen, which is the first book in the Radiant Emperor duology, which has been completed as of this August. I am so excited to be talking about this book. I reread it when I was at Sarah's from Voyage the Words. As you can maybe see, I tabbed it a lot. There's so many tabs in here. Also, thanks to Sarah, actually, I have a signed book plate in here, which I really, really love. I just think the cover is stunning. There's so much to talk about this book without even getting into what it's actually about. But without further ado, let's jump straight into my very obvious 5-star review of She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chen. So first things first, I think this book falls into a very interesting overlap between what you could call historical fiction with a question mark, and also fantastical elements sprinkled in there, because She Who Became the Sun tells the story of Zhu Tongba, who is a young girl who takes over the fate of her brother because he has been promised greatness and she has been promised that she will be nothing, which she refuses to accept, and how she rises in power, becomes the sun, and at the end of the day, takes over control of the country, actually, and becomes an emperor. Now, the thing is, it's not just the story of, like, a quote-unquote random protagonist that Shelley Parker Chen just so happened to came up with. Zhu Tongba is actually the equivalent of the Hongwu emperor, who was the first one to found the Ming dynasty. So again, there's a lot of historical figures in this. The main character is a stand-in for a very important historical figure in Chinese history, but it's also not necessarily just a historical fiction book. I do believe, if I remember correctly, I'd have to check this again to be quite fair. Shelley Parker Chen themselves is not exactly the biggest fan of calling She Who Became the Sun historical fiction, but it has a lot of, like, if you know anything about Chinese history, specifically empirical history, or imperial history, which, to be fair, is quite a big chunk of Chinese history, but if you know anything about that, you're going to find a few characters in here that remind you of historical figures, and the second you actually look it up, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. There we go. So I personally find that quite interesting, actually. I really enjoy it when books do that. But as I said, there's also some fantastical elements here. For example, the mandate of heaven, which in this book quite literally translates to some sort of magic. We're not entirely sure yet what the mandate of heaven truly does in the first book, except that it gives you the quote-unquote permission of heaven to rule, which is something that people already believed in when it was, just the mandate of heaven. And it's basically this divine thing of ruling that a lot of Western societies had as well. It's just, it's just heaven looking at you and being like, that would be a good ruler, and then they just give you powers. And in She Became the Sun, this is people being able to conjure light. So, there's that. And I really enjoy this kind of, like, overlapping of things that have happened in our history with fantastical elements, or with taking real historic events and kind of like embellishing them a bit more. I really enjoy that specific space that books can occupy, and She Who Became the Sun is no exception to that. So another thing that makes this book so great, in my opinion, is the character work. I've already told you that the main character is called Zhu Chongba, but what you might not know if you haven't read the book, and I'm going to try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, so, you know, so people who have not read the book can watch this video and then also go buy the book and read it, by the way, because it's fantastic. But what you might not know about Zhu Chongba, and this is something that we learn within the first few pages, I do believe the first chapter is basically done with that history, she was not born with that name. Because she, throughout the first part of the first chapter, is just referred to as the girl. She doesn't have a name, or at least not one that we know. She's just called the girl by every single person, including but not limited to the narration, which makes it really interesting. The reason she's later on called Zhu Chongba is because she does not only take on the fate of her brother, but also his name. Because as the first page kind of like suggested very harshly, the kingdom, or, you know, the empire is currently suffering from a drought, and Zhu grows up in a peasant family, and the only people left in that family, which used to be pretty big, are her father, her brother, and she herself. And her brother was promised, because he got a little divination thing going on there, I suppose. He was promised that he was going to become a great man, if not the greatest, and that's a fate that has been promised to him for a while now. However, when the girl herself asks for her own fate and asks the profiteer, I don't think he's called I think he's a priest. Small details like that escape me, I will be honest there. But when she asks the priest what her fate could be, he tells her that her fate is to be nothing. And she refuses to be nothing. This is the first time that we actually see Zhu's tenacity and stubbornness come into the forefront, because she's like, I refuse to be nothing. I've worked so hard to just stay alive, and I refuse to be nothing, because to be nothing is to be dead, and I don't want to die. And as the drought, you know, carries on, as people start being a lot hungrier than they were even before that, as all of the fields dry out completely, her family is actually, there's bandits coming to her house and they kill her father, and her brother just decides to give up and die, which is something that Zhu cannot understand, because she just looks at him and he's like, you've willingly chosen to become nothing. Why would you do that? Which, again, is such a great characterization moment, because it just once more relays to you the information, or like the almost burning need of Zhu to stay alive. She's such an alive character, which I think is incredibly interesting, especially when you know, juxtapose that with how she grew up, especially with the whole drought going on. It's just so brilliant. And so looking down at her brother's dead body, she essentially decides, all right, I'm just going to take your fate. I will pretend to the heavens. This is very important for something I want to talk about later, which is the whole characterization and like focus of gender in this book specifically. She decides that she will pretend to the heavens, not just to anyone, like to normal people, quote unquote. She will pretend to the heavens that she is actually her brother, so she can take over her brother's fate, she can stay alive, and she can become the greatest, as her brother's fate has promised him. And this is actually the moment where the narration also starts calling her Zhu Chongba, which the switch is fabulous. Now, her story, her life story, essentially continues onward, as in she gets taken into a monastery, because her brother was promised to a monastery by her father, because he was sickly when he was born, and his father was basically like, I will do anything. If my son survives, I will give him up for the monastery when he's, I think when he turns 12, if I remember correctly. Obviously she's not 12, because Zhu Chongba, the actual Zhu Chongba, was her older brother, so not only is she like smaller and scrawnier than a lot of boys who sign up for the monastery right now, because she's from a peasant family and they haven't had anything good to eat for years at this point, but she's also younger than anyone else ever accepted into the monastery, so she has a fair bit of trouble there at the beginning. And after the monastery, we kind of like open up the world for her to explore a lot more. And now, the really interesting part about her character arc, in my opinion, is that it is made incredibly clear that she has one goal, and one goal only, and that goal is to pass as her brother towards the heavens as well, which is hard to do, really. She wants to pass as her brother, and she wants to inherit his fate, and she wants to become the greatest. She's incredibly ambitious. She's incredibly ambitious, she's incredibly driven as a character, and however, the interesting part here is, because it's such a, well, it's not exactly a vague goal for her, because, you know, she just wants to be the greatest, and for her that's very obvious. She has to kind of like obtain the mandate of heaven and go forth from that. But it's not exactly presented like that to the reader at first, so while it is great to know that she wants to become the greatest, there's not really a set of instructions that comes with that. She doesn't really know what to do, she doesn't really know how to do that. The only thing she can do is she can try and trust her fate to guide her to those moments that can make her so incredibly great, in whichever way, shape or form possible. So, while the goal is very clearly on page, the steps to achieving that goal are not. And this is something that continues onward throughout the book as Ju is thrown into more and more situations where she has to decide what to do in order to possibly achieve her fate. And it works brilliantly. I also want to say again that the whole thing of her, you know, passing as her brother is so incredibly important because, as I said, she's not just necessarily doing that for other people's benefit and for herself to, you know, access things that she was forbidden from accessing before. She is quite literally trying to fool heaven. This is so incredibly important because it means that it's not just necessarily about how other people perceive her, it's how she perceives herself. So for a majority of the book, Ju actually actively tries to suppress her femininity. I say femininity in quotes because she's not necessarily a woman. There's a lot of gender discussion to be had. I'm going to get to that in just a second. And it presents itself very interestingly, and another reason why I like it so much is because at this point I've grown a bit hesitant towards a lot of fiction that deals with, you know, women disguising themselves as men so they can access certain spaces, because like I know that especially in Western history this has been the case over and over again, like for example when women wanted to start studying medicine or stuff like that. So I know that this is incredibly important, but it also sometimes annoys me because a lot of books don't seem to treat it with the depth that I would like them to. Where, for example, they just go like, yeah, well, like, you know, she's still a girl, so like everything is fine, and it's kind of like either treated humorously, like for example in Mulan, which is, by the way, like the Disney movie, does present it a bit more funny, I suppose. Mulan was actually one of the comps for this book, and I fully understand why. But it also treats it as if the women still are very much aware of their own personality and also their sexuality and their gender, and sometimes it just feels very dismissive and sometimes dangerously veering towards transphobia, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. I'm not saying that all of that is done intentionally, but I am saying that sometimes storylines like that can very easily veer in that direction, and Shelley Parker Chan definitely fully avoided that. Partly, as I said, with the whole thing of, you know, Ju not only wanting to pass for other people, but towards the heavens themselves. Again, this is really, really important for her. But she's not the only incredible, interesting character in here. We also have Ouyang, who is a eunuch general for the Mongol army. He used to be... well, he used to have a family and they kind of executed everyone and he's the only one left, so he is incredibly bitter. He's a horrifying and horrible man, and I love him so much. The characters in here are done so well. Most of them are miserable. It's great, it's a great time. And he has basically the opposite problem that Ju has in some ways, is that first of all, he doesn't try to grasp for a fate that wasn't supposed to be his. Rather, he thinks that fate is entirely inevitable, and his fate is to, you know, be miserable, and or also take revenge. It's kind of like, it's a mix of both, really, because he is miserable doing his revenge. So miserable. And on the other hand, because he's a eunuch, but also a man, he falls into a very different way of performing stereotypical masculinity, because his face doesn't really align with what people think masculine faces should look like. So he's struggling a lot based on that, and also based on his heritage, because he is Nanren, or, you know, he's not a Mongol, but he is a general in the Mongolian army. Many people don't like him because of that. To be fair, his personality is also really not meant to be liked. But honestly, if people treated me the way that people treat him, I'd probably also be absolutely horrible to everyone involved. And he has his own storyline that nonetheless ever so often intertwines with Ju's. They meet every once in a while. They meet usually at very defining moments of their character arcs, specifically Ju's actually, which is very interesting. Because Ouyang kind of like has, as I said, his like little revenge story going on in the background, which Ju has absolutely nothing to do with. But it's so interesting because every single time they meet, they kind of like acknowledge each other on a deeper level than they both are comfortable with, to be quite honest. And I'm going to get to the gender debate in just a second, but I just wanted to mention there's a few other characters I really love. There's Wang Baoxiang, who is also, he's a prick. I adore him. He's also part of the Mongol army, and he's also not like there because of his heritage, because he is, I do believe, half Mongol, half Nanren, if I remember that correctly. Also because he does unmanly things like, you know, taxes and making sure that the Mongol kingdom is not just falling apart because no one is keeping up with the expenses. The good stuff. But again, here's the interesting dynamic between him and Ouyang, because Ouyang is very purposefully leaning away from being accused of, you know, being a non-masculine man, whereas Wang Baoxiang just doesn't give a fuck anymore, because he's like, you know, no one likes me anyway. My own father hates me, and he's gonna keep hating me. Well, to be fair, he's not technically his father. I believe he's his mother's brother, and he adopted him, kind of. Family dynamics are a bit weird. But you'll get the hang of it, it's fine. Also, one good thing about this book is you don't have to remember a lot of the names, and you don't have to remember a lot of the political stuff. If you want to, that's great. I did that, that's why I tabbed it. But you don't have to do any of that, and you'll still get the story, so that's nice. And, like, again, Wang Baoxiang kind of, like, leans into that non-performing masculinity thing so hard, because, again, he's like, you know, no one likes me anyway, so I might as well be who I want to be, and spit on the rest of them. So he and Ouyang, whenever they come across each other, they also have a very interesting dynamic going on there, and I really, really love that. So, yeah, and last but not least, because there's a lot other characters that I also really love, but last but not least, another one who actually does get a POV as well, and I love her so much, and that would be Ma. She is, her name is Ma Xuying, and she is the stand-in for Empress Ma, who was the first wife of the Hongwu Emperor in actual Chinese history. And she is such a lovely character. She contrasts very harshly, or like not exactly harshly, but perfectly actually. Harshly because they're opposites in a lot of ways. She contrasts with Ju, whom she meets in the Red Turban armies, which are the rebels trying to rebel against the Yuan Empire because they've had enough at this point. Fair enough, to be honest. And one of her defining personality traits, as it is portrayed in the book, is just mercy. She knows that sometimes things can only be achieved through excessive violence, but she doesn't like it. She really doesn't like it. But the thing that I loved so much is that Shelley Parker Chan doesn't portray her as, I don't know, this whimpering woman who doesn't understand that war can be necessary to cleanse this world of a great evil, but instead, Ma is one of the most compassionate characters in this book, and in my opinion, one of the strongest. The reason she clashes so well with Ju is because Ju, at her heart, is a pragmatist. If there is something that needs to be doing, she does it, and she doesn't really think twice about it. And Ma is the exact opposite, where she sees where Ju is coming from to a certain degree, but she doesn't agree with it, especially not the methods. Basically, Ju is the end justifies the means, and Ma is the end never justifies all of the means that you have to achieve the end. And their relationship especially is written so beautifully, and I love it so incredibly much. It's so good. So those are just 4 of the characters in this book. Again, there's a lot more recurring characters. There's some smaller characters that every once in a while get their appearance. If I understand it correctly, there's some that appeared very briefly in here, like Madame Zhang, who are going to get a bigger part in the second book in the duology, which is He Who Drowned the World. I haven't read it yet, and I'm so excited. But overall, the characters in this are fantastic, and the way that they interact with each other builds up so much more characterization than you could by just very simply describing a single character. And it's done so well, and Shelley Bago-chan knows exactly what they're doing, and I love it so much. So, last but certainly not least, another reason why I love this book so incredibly much is because of its discussions and its portrayals of gender. I've already touched upon this somewhat. So we basically have 4 different characters who to some extent do not perform their gender the way that they're supposed to by society. And this is the important part here, because a lot of the gender performances and a lot of the honestly gender dysphoria in this book stems from what society thinks men and women should be like. And I think this book does an incredible job at that. So first of all, we have Ju, who pretends to be her brother because she wants to inherit her brother's fate, and who also wants to become the greatest, actually, because why stop at not being nothing when you can be the greatest? The way that gender dysphoria, if I may call it that, presents within her is because every single time she internally starts acknowledging that she's a woman, or every single time she displays a skill that is supposed to be womanly, like weaving a basket, for example, or dragging water from the well to a bathroom or something like that. Every single time something like this happens, she feels the eyes of heaven upon her, which is more or less what she calls it, and so she starts panicking. Again, this is such a great way of putting it, in my opinion, because it's just this perfect mixture between, you know, something that seems almost too fantastical to be real, which is, you know, the fact that heaven is looking upon every one of us and judging every one of us, and just very real experiences of gender dysphoria that people can have, even the ones that they themselves would deem nonsensical if they hadn't have this strong of a reaction upon it. Because gender is a construct. And I know that we keep repeating this, but it's just true. And You Became the Sun works with this so beautifully, because as I said, more often than not, Ju doesn't have that strong of a reaction to her body. She kind of like just ignores it, which coincidentally also made her feel like one of the most non-binary characters ever written, because I'm not that great at imagining how characters would look like, and I could not tell you what my impressions of Ju are, like, body type wise, if you held a gun to my head. I know that her head is shaved because she is a monk. That's all I got. It's honestly done so well. She just ignores her body, and in ignoring her body, I ignore her body too. So her dysphoric reactions are not necessarily because of her body, but because of how she performs gender. So how her voice sounds like, what kind of tasks she finds easy to do or harder to do, how to interact with other people. There's this whole sequence in the monastery where she tries to learn how young boys would interact with other young boys, with the exuberance of youth and everything. And that, but also when she starts relating to female characters is when her dysphoria really comes through, because every single time something like that happens, where she looks upon a woman, for example, and is like, I understand why you're so angry, she feels as if heaven is judging her and heaven is finding her lacking, as if heaven is looking at her and going, this is not the Ju Chongma that we supposedly gave this great fate to, this is an imposter. And the interesting part about this is just how it just weaves into her storyline, in my opinion. And I also really love how, at the end of the day, it then works out. I don't want to go into too much detail there because it's just a phenomenal thing. But I absolutely love it. And on the other hand, you know, taking Ju and just setting her aside, we have Ouyang, who performs hypermasculinity in order to not necessarily compensate for something, but in order to make other people stop giving him so much of a hard time, basically. Because as I said, he's a eunuch, so in his case, he is genuinely mutilated against his will. That's very important to remind ourselves of. He had no power in that situation whatsoever. So he doesn't just necessarily ignore his body, but he outright hates it. So he, for example, he always has layered clothing on because that's what he feels more comfortable with, because that means that there's a lot of layers of clothing between him and his body, which he hates because it's a reminder of the cruelty that has been done to him. And as I said, he keeps on performing this almost very aggressive hypermasculinity in order to keep people from calling him basically just, you know, looking like a beautiful woman. And there's a lot of characters that interact with him in ways that really hurt him, because they do keep on going into this direction of, you know, well, you look like a woman, and he's like, I am not a woman, I never will be, and I hate every single one of you, and he's so right in that. He's so right in that. And then, as I said, we have those secondary characters between Ouyang and Ju, who kind of like also fall into not exactly necessarily performing gender or not performing gender, but in ways of interacting with their own gender that feels a lot freer than what Ju and Ouyang have to go through necessity. Because again, Ju is trying to pretend to be a man, because if she doesn't, she has the feeling that heaven will just basically smite her down and reduce her to the nothing that she was promised as a girl. And Ouyang is a victim. Again, this is very important to remember. He did not choose his fate. And both of them at some point are in relative situations of power, so what they try to do is they try to retain their power by acting in a certain way. Ouyang more so than Ju, actually. And now, on the other hand, we have Ma and we have Wang Baoxiang, as I said. Wang Baoxiang is not necessarily in a position of power. As I said, he is kind of like family of the Great Khan. And he is important for the paperwork and everything, and he does have a lot of influence, but he doesn't necessarily have to fear for his position and for the compromising of his position in the same way that, for example, Ouyang has. Especially because Wang Baoxiang is also not serving the people who, you know, killed his entire family. So there's that to consider. So what Wang Baoxiang does is, because it feels like he is so, you know, comfortable in him just being a man, he performs in ways that people might find not overly masculine. And he revels in that. He especially revels in people being kind of like disgusted by this, because he thinks it's fun. And because, to a certain degree, he's doing this out of spite, and good for him, honestly. But again, he has a very different reason to act the way that he does, as opposed to Ouyang. So we have this very interesting dynamic over there of one character performing hypermasculinity, and another character not really bothering, even though both are men. And it's really, really interesting. And on the other hand, you have Ma, who is the daughter of a general who dies before the book even begins, before the storyline even begins, that involves her. And she is a woman. She's perfectly fine with that, but she has struggles fitting into the womanly role, or the wife role, almost, of a woman during her time, who is not even really supposed to raise her voice as much as she does. She consistently clashes with her fiancé at the beginning, for example, because he just thinks he's hot shit, and he's really not. And she's very outspoken, she's very loud and brash, almost, in certain situations, and this is a custom thing, she doesn't have bound feet, which was a very cruel custom that a lot of women and girls went through in China. And so it's actually kind of like a big deal that she doesn't really have that. So again, she's not necessarily performing femininity in a way that feels warranted for the culture and the times that she's living through, because she is nonetheless more or less, you know, she's certain of her identity. She doesn't have to struggle with it, as for example Ju does. And in not struggling with it, she actually helps Ju a lot on her journey of, well, it's not necessarily self-discovery, because Ju is actually quite self-aware, but like, kind of like onto the road of acceptance, or on the road of looking at something through a different perspective, and it's done so incredibly well. And this is just a very rudimentary explanation of how gender works in She Became the Sun, in my opinion, but suffice it to say, I absolutely love it. It's one of my favourite parts of this book, actually, because, like, the story is, I would say, fairly standard, and again, if you know a bit more about Chinese history, you kind of know where things are going the second some names are being dropped, which is also kind of fun. But overall, the gender exploration in this book and the character works are what really stands out to me. That and the prose. I really love the prose. I love the way that Shelley Parker-Chan describes things, describes settings and characters, and lets them interact with each other. It's beautiful. I love it so much. And if any of what I said sounded interesting to you and you haven't yet picked up this duology, I highly recommend that you give it a shot, because it's so good, it's so gorgeous, and if you're at all interested in like gender exploration, especially during a different time and maybe a culture that you're not overly familiar with, I highly recommend you pick up She Who Became the Sun and see if you like it enough to continue to the second book. Because once more, it's just a duology, which is always nice because, you know, we have enough big fantasy series that we have to catch up to. So it's just 2 books and then you're done. Both have like around 400 to 500 pages, so you know, it's really not that long as well. The writing is beautiful and the character work is flawless. You don't, and this is the cool part, right, with the characters, really quick, you don't even have to like the characters to find them interesting. I love all of them, but I'm also deeply aware that every single one of them is kind of like a scumbag. So, you know, maybe we're gonna talk about my taste in fictional characters at some point, but it's not today. Today we're just gonna let that sit here and enjoy our time with it, I suppose. So, again, if you're in for gender exploration, if you're in for prophecies, if you're in for defying prophecies and also defying what your society and maybe prophecies actually kind of like want you to do, if you're in for some, well, historical elements in a fantasy book, if you're in for ruthless main characters, do yourself a favour and pick up She Who Became the Sun if you haven't already. It's just incredible. I love it so much, and I cannot sing enough praises for this book. It's just impossible. Right. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments down below when if you have read the book and or the series. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought about it and what your favourite parts are. If you haven't read the series yet, first of all, what are you waiting for? Second of all, tell me if this video at all made you want to pick it up, made you want to consider it for your TBR. And in general, just let me know what you're currently reading and what you're enjoying. So, you know, the usual. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience and that you continue having a nice reading experience, and I will see you soon.